Happy Monday, everyone. I am Elle Cole, and this is Mondays Live. So I am Elle Cole from the blog cleverlychanging.com. It's a blog about parenting, finance, health and wellness, and also homeschooling. You can also listen to my homeschool podcast, the Cleverly Changing podcast, by going to cleverlychanging.com and going to the top tab that says podcast. I invite you to listen in and engage with the information that is being shared. But we have a really great show for you today with Dr. Janus Adams.
Good morning. Happy Monday. I'm Janus Adams. I'm an author and historian. I'm also former NPR correspondent and producer and host of the Janus Adams Show on public radio. I also publish a series for children called Backpacks Kids. You can find all of that on my website, janusadams.com, Janus Adams.com, and it'll give you links to everything right there. But I just love when we get to do these Mondays Live, because the theme that I have been working on for years is one of history and healing. And that healing part is about empowerment and shoring up our righteous minds, getting beyond all the misinformation that we've all been given over the years in order, to be blunt, to shore up the doctrine of white supremacy. So getting beyond that for the health of us all, and empowering everybody to just listen, learn, and think. That's what I've been about, and that is absolutely the special show that we are bringing to you today, about the theme democracy. Elle?
Yes, we are talking about democracy. And why is this important? Because right now, we are facing a unique time in history where there's a pandemic. And the president, not too long ago, actually suggested that we postpone the election. And so we really need to talk about what democracy is and why that isn't a good idea. And so that's really what we wanted to do today in the show. So democracy here in America really means that the people have a say. Yes, we help determine who the legislative body is, and that's why voting is so important. One of the common threads throughout our shows has been the importance of our vote. We talked about the census and how that falls into play with voting, and how you need to complete the census. We also talked about the digital divide and how there are some communities in the United States, not just poor African-American communities, it's different communities throughout the United States that are not connected digitally. And it's not all about economics, but it is important that we all have access to information the same. And that's why the digital divide is important. So different shows, we also did a tribute to Representative John Lewis and C.T. Vivian. And that show really talked about, again, the importance of voting. That's what Representative John Lewis lived for. That's why he kept repeatedly, over 45 times, being placed in jail because of the right to vote and because of our civil liberties. So it is important for us to honor his legacy by voting. And I just wanted us to have this conversation so it was crystal clear what democracy is and what's really at stake right now. And so that's why we're doing this show.
Absolutely. And I will say, John Lewis, it is really quite something that he even had to be arrested all those times in the name of voting rights, in the name of human rights, in the United States, a country that prides itself on saying it's about freedom and justice for all, which it has never been. And John Lewis gave his life, his health, as symbolic of so many others throughout the so-called civil rights movement, which is actually America's human rights movement, human rights struggle. He and so many others gave everything they had to make this country much better, to have it live up to its founding principles, but to go beyond those principles, because we know the conflicts that were involved in its very founding. It is founded on stolen land. It is founded on genocide. It is founded on stealing and kidnapping and forcing people to work for nothing. So let's look at this term democracy for a moment. You know, when you look up democracy, and you will find people referring to the Greeks and Cleisthenes, the man who, quote, invented democracy. All of that is very nice. He may have invented the word democracy or demos, and the actual root of it, I'll be very specific about it, is demos, meaning people, and kratos, meaning rule, and that's what the Greek root of the word is. However, the actual structure of American government isn't Greek, it's Iroquois. George Washington himself said that he had admired the structure of the Iroquois Confederacy, which had its, quote, great law of peace that dates back to 1722. So, you know, that is 70 years before the U.S. has a completely ratified constitution, or 60 years before the U.S. has a completely ratified constitution. It is 44 years before the Revolutionary War. That is how far back the Iroquois Confederacy actually goes. And what the Iroquois Confederacy did was that it had the 6 nations, 5 nations to begin, and then it expanded to 6 nations, indigenous nations, that had joined together for their mutual benefit. And the umbrella organization was that 5 nations, 6 nations confederacy. They then still retained their independence as individual nations. So right there, you see the structure of the American government. The umbrella of the United States as an institution, with the independently operating individual states having their own constitutions, their own laws, their own ways of doing things. That is a structure rooted in the Iroquois Confederacy, going back to the 5 nations and then ultimately 6 nations structure. So right there, we posted a graphic to promote this show that said, why does freedom wear an indigenous headdress? And indeed, on the Capitol Dome, United States, Washington, D.C., is a traditional Greek-looking figure with, toga draped and all of that, of a woman, which is the European traditional symbol of freedom, like the Statue of Liberty is also a female form, but unique to the American symbol of freedom atop the Capitol. When it was commissioned, the artist Thomas Crawford actually had a traditional Greek freedom cap, which the Greeks wore for people who had been liberated for enslavement. Interestingly enough, the American who was in charge of sanctioning, authorizing that statue was none other than the Secretary of War at the time in the 1850s, Jefferson Davis, the man who becomes the head of the Confederacy. So if you want to talk about Confederate monuments, here is a different kind of monument. And he rejected the one with the slave, with the freedom cap in terms of slaves taking their freedom, because he said, and I want to get it correctly, he had not approved it because he said that it was essentially giving power of freedom to people who were not born free and should not be. Interesting. He's the head of the Confederacy later on. They are fighting to preserve enslavement of people. But what he did approve was what the artist had written, was the crest that he said that the Roman style helmet that Freedom wears, the Statue of Freedom that she wears, he said that the crest of which is composed of an eagle's head and a bold arrangement of feathers suggested by the costumes of our Indian tribes. So that is why it is, yes, the inspiration of indigenous peoples is here. It is consistently suppressed, but it is right every place we look. When we talk about Massachusetts, we're talking about the Massachusetts. When we talk about Colorado, we are talking about the Colorado. When we talk about the New Mexico, it's the Mexico, but it is, I've forgotten the exact name of the indigenous nations that essentially are the root of Mexico. I've forgotten the name, but I will tell you that, you know, it obviously goes back to the Aztecs and the
Mayan.
The Mayan. So that is, you know, a quick rundown of the background of where our democracy really comes from. And indeed, the indigenous people did have everyone participating. They did not exclude women, as which is absolutely important to this centennial year of the women's right to vote. And let's be clear, 1920, how many years is that after 1776? How many years is that since the Constitution is ratified in the 1790s, 1787? How many years is that before this land of freedom says yes to 50% of its population that is freedom, that is female? Those are the things, critical thinking, that will empower us to ask other questions when we really need to. And when I'll leave it there, but I do have the concurrent resolution that was passed by Congress to share with you afterwards.
So I wanted to bring up something about that, because what's so shocking about the fact that the law of peace is from the Iroquois is that in history and the history books that are put out and movies that were shared in the past, they always painted Indians and Native people as savages, when in fact they had a sophisticated government that the Americans did not.
Did not, but you know, more importantly, this is one of the reasons that we talk about racism and what it really means and what it does. that word savage was not about anything more than conquest. That's what it was for. Columbus arrives in 1492. He lands in an area of what is now called the Caribbean for the Caribs, who were the indigenous people living there. And it's Guanahani was the island, which is now Bermuda. And as he lands, he takes out his sword and holds it up to them. And they are not familiar with a sword, but he invites them to touch it. They obviously cut themselves. That's part of the mental training for the conquest. The very day he lands, now he comes owing his allegiance to Queen Isabella of Spain and owing his empowerment to take this trip to the Pope. And his job, it's in the very first pages of Columbus's logbook, his job is to claim the lands for the Queen. The Queen will get taxes from his trip, and claim the souls for the Pope. The Catholic Church will get the enforced tithes from the people they conquer. And talking about the word savages, what he says, he's only met these people. He says that he knows that he can claim their souls because essentially they appear to have no religion. What is he talking about? How does he know? He doesn't know. All he knows is that his job is to conquer these lands, to steal it, to conquer it, and to terrorize people into submission in the name of a European country and the Catholic Church. So that name savage is part of what will become the process of institutionalizing racism, to demean people, to say they have no rights, and to essentially create a fiction and a fantasy which becomes a violent reality that is institutionalizing the United States. When we talk racism, it has nothing to do with us personally. It has to do with the people who are perpetuating it for their own gain. That's what it's about.
Well, that's definitely a powerful message that you shared with us today. And so, I definitely learned something about the Iroquois. I believe when I was studying in history, they actually did talk about it. It's been a long time, but I think that what it tells us is that we have to study for ourselves.
And we have to answer the call when it comes. But yes, we have to study for ourselves. When you see this, we will have a few links with it that you can click through for the things that we've been talking about to see for yourself. But that is only a beginning, that we invite you to just use your imagination and say, so what's the next question? That's why we're doing this. Not to say we have all the answers, but to inspire you to ask the next question.
Absolutely. And on that note, we say, have a great week, everybody.
Have a great week, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I'm Janus Adams, and
I'm Elle Cole.
Bye now.